Good afternoon, and welcome to the Extraordinary Talk Show with your host, Della Hill. This is our second week of the show, and I would love to welcome you back. I hope you got to listen to the first week. If not, we'll go over a couple of those things again and move on to some new things too. As I said, my name is Della Hill, and I'm here to talk to you about some things that you may not have considered before. I hope you have, and if you haven't, that's why I'm here. To start with, I want to share with you a few of my favorite childhood poems. I don't know about you, but I love Shel Silverstein. I actually listened to a lot of Shel Silverstein when I was a kid because we had a really great tape of him reading some of his own poems, and that was amazing. But I memorized many of his poems, and I'm going to start today with you with this one. Listen to the mustn'ts, child. Listen to the don'ts. Listen to the shouldn't haves, the impossibles, the won'ts. Listen to the never haves, then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child. Anything can be. Even as a kid, I loved that because as a child, I was one of those kids who believed in magic. And I think maybe most kids are until we have a reason to stop believing in magic. And I think that's kind of sad. But to me, as a child, this was an adult who had written this poem telling me to hope, to believe that just because someone says something to you doesn't mean that that's what you have to follow and stick with your entire life. You don't have to live your life because someone said don't. Wow. Did you hear that? You don't have to live your life a certain way because someone said don't. You can choose to live your life the way you want. And just because I love it, I'm going to read it one more time. Listen to the mustn'ts, child. Listen to the don'ts. Listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles, the won'ts. Listen to the never haves, then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child. Anything can be. And one other thing I love about this is it doesn't say ignore the people who tell you no. It doesn't say ignore the people who tell you it's not possible. It says listen to them. Listen to them. Hear what they have to say. Take it in, evaluate it. And then you choose for yourself what can happen to you. And that's really pretty magical. One thing we talked about last week was Brules, for example. And Brules, in case you can't hear me clearly over the radio, that starts with a B. That's a B as in boy. B-R-U-L-E-S. Brules. And Brules stands for BS rules. The rules that you followed all your life until you looked at them and you realized, you know what, maybe that's not a rule that fits me or that fits my life. One other thing I want to repeat real quick while I'm thinking about it from last week is the idea of being skeptical. I encourage everyone to be skeptical. And again, I'm not trying to tell you what to do, what to think. I'm only encouraging you to think for yourself. When it comes to being skeptical, if you believe every single thing that comes your way, you're not a skeptic. But the same is true for the other end of the spectrum. If you disbelieve everything you hear, you're also not a skeptic. The true skeptics are the ones that listen, that hear it out, that evaluate it, and decide for themselves. And sometimes with some information that might come your way, you may not be able to decide if it's right or wrong at that time. You just kind of have to set it to the side, put it on a shelf, and come back to it later when you find more information that can prove it or disprove it. But the idea is to consider, be willing to consider that some things are possible, even if you didn't think that they were possible before. So jumping back to rules, a lot of times we stick with our rules, the things that we've been doing our whole lives, because it's comfortable. We, as humans, love what is familiar. Our brains love what is familiar. In fact, sometimes our brains give us what is familiar even when it's bad for us because it's just what we're used to. For example, if you're, say, physically in pain and you've been in pain for so long that you get used to it, your brain might not know what to do if you weren't in pain. And that's something that you kind of have to retrain your brain to be able to accept something that's unfamiliar. Another example of this is if you tend to get into relationships that are negative, not really good for you, not very positive, but they're familiar. Maybe you're used to being spoken to so negatively. Maybe, and this can go back to when you were a very little child, and a lot of things go back to when we were a very little child, and someone that was close to you, might have been your parents, might have been a babysitter, spoke negatively to you, put you down, and that became comfortable. You got used to that. So later on in your life, when you're maybe looking for relationships, you find people in relationships that maybe do the same thing, that put you down, that aren't very nice to you, because that's what's familiar to you. And even though it's not the best thing, you accept it because it's what's familiar. And that's a problem with a lot of rules. We blindly accept them because we don't consider otherwise, and our brains love what is familiar. Talking about our brains, and I think brains are really fascinating. You may have heard the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. And that means that your brain likes to do the same thing. Your brain loves familiarity. And when the neurons in your brain fire regularly in one way, they build those pathways, they build those networks, and then your brain becomes very, very comfortable with that. Perfect example is brushing your teeth. Which hand do you brush your teeth with? Probably if you're right-handed, you brush with your right hand, and if you're left-handed, you brush with your left hand. And that's what is familiar, and that's what you've been doing your whole life since you learned to brush your teeth when you were a very, very little kid. Have you ever tried trying to brush your teeth with the other hand? I highly recommend it. And part of the reason I recommend it is because it makes your brain work a different way. You have those neuron pathways to brush your teeth with your right hand that are almost set in stone, except nothing in your brain is set in stone. It's very, very malleable. But they're so permanent because that's the way you've been doing it for years, decades. And when you try to do the exact same task that you've done thousands and thousands of times in your life, but you do it with your other hand, it's unfamiliar. Your brain doesn't have the pathways designed for that. How do you make those pathways? Well, that's really easy. You just brush your teeth with your other hand, and you do that over and over and over until it builds those pathways. And that's actually a really, really great way to exercise your brain. Your brain gets a little bit sleepy when you don't make it work. If you're not learning anything new, if you're not doing anything new, your brain tends to get sleepy. I'm here to help you wake your brain up. I'm here to help you think of some new things, come across some new ideas, and make your brain consider things differently. Try some new wiring pathways and break out of the box that your comfortable, familiar neural pathways are in. Talking about rules, our rules are kind of projected onto us from our family, from society, from friends. And it's very, very important to be able to look at your life and realize, what things am I doing because I'm comfortable with them? What things am I doing because they're familiar? What things am I doing because someone else expects me to? And that's what we also call living someone else's dogma. And you're never going to find true fulfillment and satisfaction living someone else's dogma. So evaluate your rules. And your rules can be anything simple from, we talked about last week, if you cut a roast in half before you put it in the pan because your grandma's pan was too small, that can be something very, very small. It can be big things like how you choose to have relationships in your life. Maybe the pathway that was always taught to you, that you always saw, that you're familiar with, isn't actually the pathway that will bring you the most joy. And I feel like I could go on and on and on and say almost that exact same thing over and over with many, many different topics. Some of the other places you can find rules is with education, with your career, with religion. And when it comes down to it, I want you to consider any person, anything, any entity that tells you this is what you must do. There is no other way, and you shouldn't even question. You should just do this because it's what we're telling you to do. Anybody that says that, you should probably take a second, maybe third, maybe fourth look and see if that pathway that they're setting for you is really what's right for you. Anyone who tells you not to question is someone you should question. Everything I'm telling you right now, I hope that you question. I really, really do. The last thing that I want is for you to turn on this radio and believe me blindly either. In fact, if you're doing that, that'll make me feel bad because that's going against everything that I'm trying to teach you. So when you have those moments where someone says, this is the only way to do it, we all know that it's not the only way to do it. Some of our great rule breakers throughout history, for example, Christopher Columbus. Okay, and I'm not going to go into a whole history lesson because we all know that he wasn't really the first person to come to America. But he lived at a time where there was a very, very big rule that was accepted widely that the earth was flat, or those that did accept that it was flat or that it was round, because there were some that knew it was round, were terrified to go too far in the ocean. And he was one of the ones that said, okay, everybody else has followed this rule of not going away from the seashore in a boat, but I'm ready. We're ready. And he must have done a good job because I still remember the names, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria that I learned about in elementary school. Because he was brave enough to break a rule. And it was a pretty big rule. He had to go to the queen herself to be able to break this rule. But he did it. Anybody that really kind of finds a new way forward, you might consider the makers of Apple or the makers of, it was Macintosh back in the day. You might consider them rule breakers. One of my favorite current rule breakers is Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla, the Boring Company, and a few other companies that he has. He's definitely a guy that is doing things differently. He looked at the way that the world was working and realized that's not going to work long term. We need better solutions. We need better answers. And we have no excuse to sit around and wait. So he took it upon himself. He did his research, did his homework, and he actually did a lot of really cool things to get himself where he is right now. And it took a lot of courage and faith on his part. And maybe I'll dedicate one episode just to talking about him and some of the really cool things that he has done. That guy is definitely a rule breaker. Not rule breaker, but rule breaker. I'm sure you can look around you and see people that you admire. Some of the people that you admire the most tend to be rule breakers. They're the people who don't sit back and do it the way everybody else does. They're the ones who are not content with what's normal, what's acceptable for everybody else. Now, breaking rules can be amazing. You might discover a new continent, or you might just change your outlook on your own life. And if that's all that happens, that's a step forward. There can be some downsides of breaking rules. Life is all about experience, and you might see a rule and say, okay, that's not something I'm going to live by anymore. So you break it, and then you find out, oops, there was a reason for that rule. Maybe it wasn't actually a rule. Maybe that was actually something I should follow. So you might find that, and guess what? That's the risk you take. But the benefit is now you know. You might have gotten into some trouble or had some hard times because you were breaking that rule, but now you know. If you didn't know before that was a bad rule for you, now you know it was a bad rule for you. Many times you might try a different pattern, a different pathway, and that can be very damaging to the people around you, possibly. Because the people around you are also used to what's familiar. and they're used to getting the same thing from you. You are familiar to them. The way that you do things, the way you talk, the way you act is familiar to the people around you. And when you change those things, when you discover new ideas that you're evaluating, when you maybe decide to break some rules and make some changes in your life and live your life a little bit differently, that becomes very unfamiliar to the people around you. And sadly, that can be harmful to relationships. I've experienced this myself, and it can be really sad. I've had some people who I loved, who I admired, say some things to me that were hurtful, that were very sad. And it really came out of a misunderstanding on their side because they didn't see what I was seeing. They were still back in their familiar path. And when I tried to break out of the familiar path, that was uncomfortable to them. I can't blame them for caring about me. I can't even be mad at them for the things that they said, because everything that they said was truly out of concern for me. But if you remember what we were talking about last week, those people have their own perspective. They have their own filter of their life that's very different from my life, my filter, my perspective. And sadly, they were not able to see the things for me that I see for myself. Because guess what? Nobody else gets to see for me my life better than I do. And the same is true for you. No one knows more about your life. No one knows more about what's right for you than you do. As a matter of fact, that brings me to my next Shel Silverstein poem that I want to read to you. Most of Shel's poems are pretty short, and this one's relatively short too. If your radio could not just transmit sound, but could transmit emotion, you would feel the way that my heart beats when I read this poem. It's called The Voice. There is a voice inside of you that whispers all day long. I feel that this is right for me. I know that this is wrong. No teacher, preacher, parent, friend, or wise man can decide what's right for you. Just listen to the voice that speaks inside. So as you're listening to all the voices around you, teachers, preachers, parents, friends, wise men, people on the radio, remember, nobody else knows what's right for you. Not as well as you do. And the people in your life who care about you, they can have some great input. They can have some great advice. And please consider that. You can take that in with all the information that you take to evaluate and decide. They can have some really, really great advice, some great suggestions. But again, that's what they are, coming from someone else. The only one who can decide is you. And I found that we do have that voice that speaks inside, the one that Shel's talking about there. And that little voice that's inside, sometimes it's difficult to listen to. But that voice knows us better than we know ourselves. And it's often hard to listen to because that voice sees us differently than we see ourselves. One term for that voice you might call the subconscious. We'll go with that because it's a simple voice. You could also call it your higher self. There's many, many things. I'll call it the subconscious just to keep things simple. It speaks to you all the time. The problem is that you have other voices that are also kind of talking in your head. And those other voices might be repeating things that they've heard, especially if you've had people say mean things to you, talk down to you, speak negatively to you. You have a recorder in your head that records every single one of those voices. And when your head is quiet, those voices tend to speak up again. And that can be pretty devastating. And then even if you have your little voice, your subconscious that's speaking in the back, saying, hey, don't listen to that. I'm the one who's telling you the truth. You are wonderful. You are valuable. All those other things are false. It's kind of hard to hear that over all the negativity in your head. So be aware. When you have the little voices in your head putting you down, telling you you're not good enough, tell those voices to shut up. They don't belong there. They have not earned a place in your head. They don't deserve to be there. Instead, set those aside and for a minute, listen carefully in your head for that little voice that's saying, you are wonderful. You are beautiful. You are enough. If you spend a little bit of time focusing on it, you can hear that voice. One voice that you hear that, or one time you hear that voice a lot, is when you meditate, if you meditate. And I hope that you do. And if you don't, I hope you start, because that's where that voice can come through. And in that time, you can see things, be aware of things that you have a very, very difficult time being aware of and understanding when you're wide awake, when you're in what we call the beta mind level, which is the most awake mind level. It's very hard to hear those things. Now, if you've never meditated before, if you don't know how, guess what? I can help you. I am myself a meditation coach. And in fact, tonight, Monday night at 7 p.m., I am doing a group guided meditation. And I do these very regularly, but this is the first time I've been able to mention it on the radio. So if you would like to try this, if it sounds interesting, or if you've just wanted to try meditation and hadn't had a chance before, please, I invite you wholeheartedly to come tonight. It's at Shake Up Dixie, which is an Herbalife club just off of the Boulevard. The address is 122 North, 500 East. It's in the Lip Tricks complex. It's, if you turn where you see the sign for Pendleton Furniture, it's right there in that itty bitty little strip mall. And guys, I have a really, really awesome meditation plan for tonight. I promise you that if you come, you will be glad that you did, and you're going to want to come to the next one as soon as we have the next one. So again, that's tonight, Monday night, 7 o'clock at Shake Up Dixie at 122 North, 500 East, right off the Boulevard. So I hope to see you there. If it's your first time to come to this Herbalife Club, your whole visit is free, and you'll get some tea and a wonderful, healthy, nutritious shake, which is actually really great to have right after you meditate. You kind of need that protein and those nutrients to help your body ground a little bit. If you've come before, or if you love it so much you want to come again and again and again, it's $7 other times. But also, if you want to come and you absolutely don't want to pay the $7, you're welcome anyway. We would love to just have you there to share in the experience with us. So I'm going to digress back to that little voice that speaks inside. There's ways that voice can speak to you, even if you don't realize that it's speaking to you. And you may be aware of that voice. You may be pretty good at listening to it. Maybe sometimes you listen to it better than others. That's how I know I am. I know there's times when I'm really, really good at listening to it, and other times that I kind of tune it out. And that's too bad for me, because I'm missing out on a lot of support and help in my own life when I close that out. So I make an effort to listen to that voice, to hear it. And it's hard when you first start, because it takes some getting used to. It's kind of like having a friend in your head, and you have to build a relationship with that friend, just like you do with any friend. You have to realize what they mean when they talk, when they're talking, and you have to sort it out from what I call the ego, the voice in your head that's more you, it's more your conscious you, that's trying to be logical, that's trying to be rational. But that's the voice, your ego voice is the one that doesn't get it all, doesn't see it all, that's trapped in your box, in your little familiar, comfortable neurological pathways. And it's sometimes hard for that voice to move out of the way, to let your subconscious really let you know what it's trying to tell you. One way that I think is really beautiful is what I call truth bumps. You might call them goosebumps. And sometimes if you just walk outside and it's chilly, you might get goosebumps. But here's the thing. If you hear something, read something, think something that resonates with you, sometimes you will get goosebumps. But in this case, they're not goosebumps. They are truth bumps. And that is that little voice telling your body, hey, that's a real thing. That's for real. React to that. So your body gets goosebumps. And it's a little signal to you, hey, there's something there. There's something real. There's something to that. It's a hope of mine that you've maybe had some truth bumps while you're listening to the show. So listening to that voice is really, really a wonderful thing. It's a blessing for you. It's a gift for you. And it's for everyone. Don't just think, okay, well, she's special. She's got that going on. I am no better than anyone else. The other side of that is that nobody's better than me. I'm better at some things. Other people are better at some things. We all have different talents and attributes, and that's one of the wonderful things. But when it comes to hearing that voice, if I'm hearing my subconscious and you're not, all that means is that I've been trying for longer. You can, it's there, and it really does want to talk to you. Now, this might sound weird. And if you remember what I told you last time, everything is weird until it's considered mainstream. And if you're listening to this and thinking it's weird, this is one of those things that I want you to take like mind candy. Consider it, evaluate it, let it roll around in your brain, and you decide what to do with it. If you listen to me and think that lady's crazy, you change the station, never listen to me again, you're not a true skeptic. If you take what I'm saying and evaluate it for yourself, that's what makes you a skeptic. Guys, I have about 3 more pages of notes of things that I would love to talk to you about, but unfortunately my time has come to an end. So for the next week, consider what rules you have in your life and try to listen for that voice, because I promise you it's there. It loves you. It wants the best for you. If you're trying to find it, it's the little voice in your head that is saying you're good enough. Listen for that. And again, I hope that I get to see all of you tonight at Shake Up Dixie for our beautiful group guided meditation. It's really going to be awesome. That's tonight at 7 at Shake Up Dixie, 122 North, 500 East by Liptrix. Guys, this is Della with the Extraordinary Talk Show, and I can't wait to talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.